Hi everyone, I'm here with George Monbiot. He's an author, columnist and environmental activist. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with his work, and George was a household name in our family, so I'm starstruck to be here. George's latest book, Out of the Wreckage, is incredibly exciting, and I want to talk to George today about how it fits in with public ownership and your views on what public ownership can do for society. So thanks, George, for joining us.
Thanks, Kat.
So I'd like to start off by asking, how do you feel about Labour's latest manifesto and its proposals to bring rail, Royal Mail, energy and water into public ownership?
I think it's very exciting, and I think it's a great step towards the sort of world that we want, the sort of nation that we want, but I think it can go further. And what I want to see is the idea of public ownership being expanded from state ownership to commons ownership as well. That's not saying I don't want to see state ownership, I do. I also feel that for certain resources, particularly natural wealth, public spaces, land in general, the nature which occurs on that land, we should tend towards much more of a commons model than a state model. And a commons has really three elements. It's first of all a community, which is the group that manages a particular resource, and the resource is a second element, and it is the rules and negotiations that the community creates in order to manage it. And a commons is inalienable, you can't sell it, you can't give it away, and it's managed in perpetuity on the basis that any product from it is shared equally among its members. So what's amazing about the commons is that it's inherently quite sustainable, because you're not trying to extract from it any more than the natural product which occurs, which doesn't deplete the actual wealth from which that product arises. It's not capitalism and it's not communism. It's a different system altogether, and it's one of the great neglected pillars of our economy.
So where do you see it fitting in? So we talk generally about public services, so we'll talk about rail and buses, water and energy, NHS, care work, council services, prisons and probation, and we talk about these as public services. Which of those do you think should be run not by any kind of state, even a very democratic, engaging state, but somehow by the commons or by the people directly?
I could see water as being a very good candidate for common ownership if you managed water at the catchment level. And we always tend to forget where the water that we drink and wash in comes from, which it comes from the hills. Well, it comes from the sky, and then it lands on the hills, and then it flows down into the rivers and fills the reservoirs and fills the aquifers. We've tended only to think about water as what you get at the bottom of the catchment. And when we think about floods, we think about the management of the floodplain, but we don't think about the whole catchment. Now, that catchment could easily be seen as a political unit. And in ecological terms, it makes sense to manage it as a political unit. So, instead of having county lines which cut across the catchment, or instead of even having national lines cutting across the catchment, you say, here is the ecological unit we should be managing. And we should be doing so in such a way that what happens at the top of the catchment fits in with our objectives at the bottom of the catchment. And very often that means if you're going to have clean water, if you're not going to have flood peaks, you want to have trees growing at the top of the catchment, you want your rivers to meander and braid to hold back the flood water, to filter the water out. You want a sense that everyone in that catchment has a role in deciding how the water is going to be used for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of the rest of the living world. And to me, that makes water much more of a live issue. You get much more of a sense of belonging to the issue and the issue belonging to you than if it's in the more remote hands of state ownership.
So we're developing a people's plan for water, which is about saying, okay, here's your water company right now, and they are in sort of water basins, so they geographically make sense where they are right now. They're regional structures. We're saying, what would you do if you had more ownership over this company and it was working for you? We're still imagining that it would be a democratically accountable regional structure. do you see public ownership or common ownership of water not involving any democratic sort of element, but involving something more direct? How does it work in terms of governance?
Well, the commons is democratic. It's participatory democracy. And another element of the commons is that everyone has an equal share, an equal stake, and an equal voice in the management of the common resource. And so in a way, it's more democratic than the representative democratic structures which we often use to manage state resources or resources in other forms of public ownership. Now, this is not to say in any way that I'm dissing state ownership, because I think we need that too. But we need an economy balanced between the four pillars. And the only ones we talk about are market and state. And if you're on the left, you say you want less market and more state. And if you're on the right, you say you want more market and less state. But there's two other pillars, which are the household, the core economy, that sits at the centre of the economy, and the commons. And actually, I feel what we need is a balance between those four pillars, which recognises the importance of all.
So what's the actual institution that manages it? You talk about community land trusts. Mm. Would you have a community water trust, and would there be any election to that?
Well, yes. I mean, a community land trust is a classic form of commons management. And depending on its size, you might have a situation where everybody comes together in meetings to decide how that land is used, or you might have a situation where there are certain occasions on which everyone comes together, but a lot of the time you're delegating the decision making to a committee. And I don't see any reason why the same approach can't be applied to catchment scale water management.
Mm. I suppose, so something that we often talk about is the Parisien model, where they brought water into public ownership in 2011, and they've created a structure where they've got citizens and workers as part of the governance structure, and they also have an observatoire, so they have lots of different community groups who are holding the company to account and making sure that they deliver for the wider community and making sure that it really works well. So I suppose I'm wondering, in practice, if it does get delegated, what's the difference between a really democratic, participatory, engaged structure that is nevertheless official in some sense and has an official mandate to deliver versus some kind of community water trust?
I would say they're both valid models for doing it, and they could both lead to very similar outcomes, which is democratization, which is public control, which is probably much lower prices and higher quality than we're getting from the purely market approach at the moment. But there's something important about the principle of the commons in its own right. William Cobbett called them the fortifying commons, and it wasn't just that you could run around outside on the common land and get strong. They fortified your sense of citizenship. They fortified your sense of belonging. They fortified the notion that you actually have a stake rather than just a say, because a commons belongs to the community. If you put it in market terms, but it's not a market, the community members would all be shareholders in it. But it's a much deeper sense of belonging than shareholding. And I would argue it's a deeper sense of belonging than state ownership, however democratically arranged it is. That's not to say that I'm dissing the Parisien model. I think it is perfectly valid. I think it could be even better. Mm.
And I think it's really exciting to read in your book about that sense of belonging and the politics of belonging. And it feels very grounded, and it feels like it has a huge amount of potential to engage people. One thing I'm wondering is, what about the national level? Because you talk about how, in terms of regulating the commons, traditionally people have regulated it themselves on a local level, and that's how it works. And it feels as though it has to be very local. But we have public services and national government partly to make sure that we have equity, and when we have unequally distributed resources, you know, those are fairly distributed and people get equal outcomes where that's needed. I mean, water obviously is a bit different, but, you know, say in the case of energy, you know, some areas will be able to generate lots of energy, others won't. So is it just, well, postcode lottery, raw deal if you can't? We also have the national level for standards and a framework and planning and integrated systems. So how does that come together with the local commons?
To my mind, it's not either or. It's about seeking a balance. And so, for instance, if you were to look at land, and if we had much more progressive land taxes than we have at the moment, you could say, well, each community should tax its own land and keep the taxes and distribute that money within the community. But then that means that the places with the very valuable land, where often people are more prosperous than the places with the less valuable land, have a lot of money to distribute, and the other places have much less. So we need distribution between communities as well as within communities, and that's where the role of national government comes in, which should be distributive and should be using tax for all its varied purposes, to have at the same time, wherever possible, the local link, the sense of local ownership, the sense of belonging, the sense of a participatory democracy at a scale where it's meaningful, and generally the smaller the scale, the more meaningful democracy is, I think is valuable in its own right. So wherever possible, we tend to that model. Local as far as possible, but when we need to distribute more widely, and when we need to manage a resource which is more than local and can't only be governed at the local level, like the NHS, for example, then we move to state ownership and maybe tempered by forms of participatory democracy as well. So it's a question of having a hybrid politics and a hybrid economy. It's not just state and market, it's state, market, household and commons.
Yeah, we're often thinking about, national, regional, local, how do they interrelate? But maybe we can bring the commons into the analysis of the local more to kind of
I think
create a hybrid model.
I think this is crucial. I mean, all too often, local government is like just a microcosmic version of national government. But actually, you can do things at the local level that you can't do at the national level because the scope for participatory democracy is so much greater locally. And if all you're doing is replicating Westminster politics within your local county hall, then you are losing a huge opportunity to do something really exciting.
Definitely. George, do you agree with us that we already own many of these common resources like water, and so we don't need to be compensating shareholders when we take them back?
It's a really interesting question, because justice says we've paid for this many times over. First of all, they took it away from us. There are two forms of enclosure. There's the state taking it from communities, but then there's the private sector taking it from the state at knockdown prices. We know that it was effectively stolen. And so justice says we should just take it back. In practical terms, it can be really, really difficult to do that without facing massive lawsuits and a huge political headache, which can turn out to be a lot more expensive than paying the bastards. Now, I revolt against the idea of paying the bastards because they don't deserve to be paid. It's like compensating the slave owners for the slaves when emancipation happened. It's just wrong. But it could be the realpolitik thing that we have to do just to make it happen. I've followed land reform in quite a lot of countries, and basically where people try to do it without compensation, it almost always falls apart, simply because the kickback is so massive, and the owners invest such huge resources into fighting it. It brings governments down, it just creates huge political conflict. And my own feeling, much as I sympathise with the case, is just swallow hard, look the other way, give them the money and get the job done and bring it back into public ownership. I hate the principle of it, but I think that might be the practical politics of it.
Although Parliament can decide how much, so it's always going to be a question of how much.
Yes, that's right.
Is
that's right. So I think what reasonable. You can do is to say, okay, let's look at the fact that basically they got this for next to nothing. We're not going to pay them what they think they can get as a market rate, but we're going to pay them enough to make them go away without a humongous battle. I think that's the principle I would probably apply and will when I rule the world.
Fantastic. So We want to make sure that public ownership, when it happens, if it happens when it happens, is much more successful than anything we've seen before. And as well as democracy, we also want to see it being more innovative and greener and more caring and just better on all fronts, so that we have something really resilient that can survive, not just the next Labour government, but beyond, if we end up with the Tory government, beyond that. What are your other thoughts on how we make public ownership really amazing?
My overriding objective is what I call private sufficiency, public luxury. If we try to all enjoy private luxury and all have our own swimming pool and tennis court and play barn and art collection and the rest of it, very quickly we literally fill the whole world up. And you suddenly discover that actually only a few people can have that, because there's simply not enough physical space or ecological space for everyone to do it. If you all try to live like the ultra-rich today, we burn the planet up and we use all its resources and we turn it into a dystopia. But there is enough space for everyone to enjoy public luxury. Fantastic quality public amenities where everybody gets to play tennis if they want to play tennis, and everybody gets to swim if they want to swim, and there are amazing playgrounds and wonderful parks and beautiful nature reserves, and everything that you would look for in your own life to enhance your luxury is found in the public or the common sphere. And that way you genuinely make this a land of luxury for all, rather than luxury for some. The other thing about public luxury is it's far more efficient than private luxury. So, for example, you can say, oh, I'm sick of being stuck in traffic in my old banger. I'm going to get a really fancy car. I'm going to spend 20,000 quid on a fancy car. You're still stuck in traffic and you're 20,000 quid down. Now, imagine if £1,000 of your taxes and everybody's taxes were invested in a really great mass transit electrified system which was super efficient. You're going to get there at 10 times the speed, and it's cost you 1/20th of what that fancy car cost you to get stuck in traffic. So you can actually use resources far more efficiently when you are seeking public luxury than when you're seeking private luxury.
I love that. I love that concept of public luxury. It's just brilliant. What are your favourite 3 public services, by the way? Well,
having had my life saved recently by it, the NHS has to come in at number 1. I'm loving my children's engagement with state education, which gets a very bad press, but both of them are having a great experience with it at the moment. So I think I would put that in as number 2. It's a bit boring, hospitals and schools, but then who doesn't love them or who shouldn't love them? And then I think number 3 would be parks. Great parks are absolutely essential, I think, for a sense of local community, a sense of place, a sense of belonging. I think place is very important in our lives and is often greatly underestimated. And a park which is really nicely looked after, which has some wild areas ideally, as well as the manicured areas, has great playgrounds for the kids, a place where people can come together. Ideally there might be a cafe where you could have tea as well. I think that is a really important part of the public sphere.
And final question, when we have public ownership, do you see all of our interests aligning? So the public, workers, the environment, the earth that we live in, are there going to be conflicts?
It's very important to recognise that the public is not just workers. And I think it was a mistake going all the way back to guild socialism to basically vest political power in workers and to see the workers as being the only really valid political force, because straight away that means that anyone who doesn't have work, or anyone who's retired, or children for that matter, they don't have a legitimate political voice. But it's become even more problematic in an age where hardly anyone has a proper job anymore, where it's very hard to know, are you actually a worker in this because you're having to come in and out of it as 0-hour contracts and the gig economy. And I think we need to broaden out the scope of where political validity lies. It lies with everyone, of course, but the hub of it, I feel, is community. This is why I think the politics of belonging is where the big change will come. Building it up from the bottom up in community. And of course, workers are a very important element of that, but they don't have to be attached permanently to one industry to be an important element of that. Their voice must be heard, but alongside the many other community voices that have to be heard. So the rail users, as well as the rail workers, and the people whose backyard the new railway might go through too.
Absolutely. Fantastic. George, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kat.
I'm so excited to be talking to you today, and everyone should read this book. Thanks, George.
Thanks very much, Kat. Brilliant. Lovely.